Hello, welcome back to B&J's Little Farm. How's everybody doing tonight? Notifications are going off. We got 2 watching. Hello. Alright, we're going to go ahead and get started. We're on Wings of a Dream and we are on chapter 30. Oh, I guess I need to bring up the YouTube in case anybody comes in to comment. Let me get... There we go. Being all messages. Alright, here we go. On Monday, the sheriff stopped by for a moment to deliver the mail, saying Mr. Culpepper was down in his back. On Tuesday, Sheriff Jeffries found me in Mr. Crenshaw's store as I shopped for supplies with the money Frank had brought home. And then on Wednesday, the sheriff's car chugged up the lane with no other aim but my company, or so he said. I wouldn't again make the mistake of assuming more than was said. For now, I'd spend time with the sheriff and trust the Lord to guide me. Like watching plums turn purple in summer, waiting until the perfect moment of squishy sweet to pluck them from the tree and pop them in my mouth, and Mama would approve, I felt certain. Hey Photos Against Anxiety, good to see you. I just started out on chapter 30 of Wings of a Dream. Ollie finished the dishes as I changed into my Sunday best. When I walked into the kitchen, Sheriff Jeffries' hat danced in his hands as a strained smile played at his lips. Frank, on the other hand, stared at me as if I were no more than a scarecrow in a cornfield. No matter, I buttoned my coat and gave the sheriff my full attention. Shall we drive, Mr. Jeffries? Hey, Vermont, good to see you. He returned his hat to his head and held out his arm to escort me. You needn't wait up, I called back. I can see myself in. I didn't wait for an answer. We bumped over rutted roads, down paths meant for cows, seeing little as the gray evening slipped on its inky cloak. The sheriff talked of Prater's Junction, of the Texas Rangers, of his dreams for a home and a family. My stomach churned as he talked, wanting him to offer to take me with him into adventure, yet wishing he wouldn't declare his intentions just yet. You know, Rebecca, from the first moment, do you think you could teach me to drive? His foot hit the brake. We jerked to a stop. He stared at me, his face illuminated by the rising moon and the backwash of the headlamps. What? Drive a car? Do you think you could teach me? He scratched the back of his head, tipping his hat over his eyes. I'm not sure it's a good idea for a girl. I'm not a girl, Sheriff. I'm a woman, and women drive too. At least some do, I have seen in magazines. Still, he shook his head. I leaned closer. Please? He frowned as he pushed his hat back into its rightful place. All right, but just this once. With a squeal, I changed places with him, setting my hands on the steering wheel, listening closely to his instructions. With the car in gear, I eased off the brake and opened the throttle. We inched forward. I laughed, eyes on the strip of light showing the road ahead. The braver I got, the faster we went, bumping along in the dirt, sometimes on the worn track, sometimes into unmarked grass. For the first time in my life, I felt free. I held the wheel. I decided our course. I wanted to go on and never stop. Filled with glee, I glanced at the sheriff. He remained thin-lipped, but he'd get used to this, I felt for sure. He planned to be a Texas Ranger after all. He could understand my desire for adventure. But before I knew it, Frank Gressom's house loomed in the dark, and I knew that pursuing adventure with the sheriff meant leaving the Gressoms behind. The thought pinched my heart like shoes too tight. How could I survive without James' sweet face and Dan's rambunctious 4-year-old antics, Ollie's shy smile, and Janie's teeth emerging into her joyful grin? We motored toward the fence, my mind still lost in anguished thoughts. Hey, Dragon, good to see you. Slow down, Sheriff Jeffries. He put his hand on the steering wheel. I can do it. I yanked in the opposite direction. White pickets, glowing beneath the full moon, appeared closer and larger. My foot missed the brake. Wood splintered. A headlamp went dark. The engine died without a sputter. Sheriff Jeffries particularly sat in the same seat with me now, his foot hard on the brake. I looked up. A shadowy figure rose from a chair on the porch and walked towards us. Frank. I pushed open my door and stood on shaky legs, straightening my hat. The sheriff inspected his car. Frank kept his eyes on me. I refused to turn from his reproachful gaze. I'm so sorry, Sheriff. I hope I didn't hurt anything. Only my fence, Frank grumbled. I gave him the most exquisite smile. Nothing that can be repaired, right? The sheriff cleared his throat. I turned to him. I do thank you for the ride. When did I start sounding so much like Mama? My pleasure. I'll see you Sunday. Hey, Halloween Collector. Good to see you. Firefly, hello. Good evening, Jen. Hey, everyone. Yes, please hit the thumbs up. Share me out if you have the capability. I looked to Frank, then back to the sheriff. Of course. And I am sorry about your car. No harm done, at least not much. He cranked the engine and backed out the yard. Down the road it rattled. I winched. I didn't remember that sound from before. Thankfully the noise faded, leaving only the serenade of night, and Frank's huffing. What were you doing? Frank asked in the darkness. Driving a car. What did it look like? Mayhem. I'll thank you not to drive near my fence again. He stalked towards the house, then stopped, turned back. But I'm glad you're not hurt. I kicked a turf of dead grass, smashed it into the dirt, the corner of my mouth drifting downward of its own accord. Of course he was glad. He needed a nursemaid for his children for a little while longer. Hey, Nate, good to see you. At church that Sunday, I sat between the boys, an arm around each of them. Ollie and Janie flanked their daddy, pink flushing their cheeks at his attention. Worshippers slipped in around us. I cranked my neck toward the back, searching for the sheriff. Irene started the opening bars of the hymns on the small organ. Only then did he slip into a back seat and lay his hat on his lap. I turned my attention to the service, satisfied. After the closing hymn, I buttoned James and Dan into their coats. Frank did the same with the girls. Irene caught my hand, her cheeks glowing red as coals in a stove, her eyes shiny as clean window pane. I'd like y'all to come for dinner today, she said. I remembered the smallness of her house and imagined the meagerness of her cupboard. There's no need. We'd love to. Frank glared at me as our words overlapped each other. My back stiffened. How could he be so selfish? They didn't have room for us there. And I'd cooked a chicken pot pie for us, its golden dome only wanting to be reheated. Frank juggled Janie and his big Bible, one in each arm. Like I said, we'd love to partake of a meal with you and your family. I glanced toward the back of the room. The sheriff spoke with the Crenshaw family. I've invited the sheriff too, Irene said. I pressed my lips into a smile as Irene's gaze moved from Frank to me to Frank again. Come on directly. I have a ham all ready. Irene gathered her hymnal and Bible and pocketbook. I sighed and shooed the boys out the door. It wasn't that I didn't appreciate the invitation or the inclusion of the sheriff. Truth be told, I had no idea why her words stirred my dissatisfaction, other than the fact that my heart refused to follow what my head deemed the most prudent course. Climbing into the buggy, settling Janie on my lap, I thought of Mama again, of her constant request that I return home. I imagined Mama would encourage me to stay if she knew of the sheriff and his intentions. But did I want her to know yet? Frank's deep voice rumbled in answer to one of the boys' question. No, I couldn't tell her about any of it, not yet. I lowered my head until my cheek pressed against Janie's. I prayed again that the Lord would show me his way. Not Mama's, not mine, not Irene's, his. A terrifying thought, and yet one that stirred the same feeling of freedom I'd felt when I'd steered the sheriff's car behind the line of light piercing the darkness. Firefly, I want chicken pot pie. Dragging order up. Chapter 31. Irene's house proved as cramped as I imagined it would be, but she didn't seem daunted. She directed her girls to set the table while she finished cooking. We'll serve the chicken their dinner on the porch, she told me. We'll serve the chicken. What the heck? We'll serve the children their dinner on the porch, she told me. I'll make sure they get their coats on then. But that task didn't prove as simple as it sounded. I don't want my coat. Dan crossed his arms. But it's cold outside. It's not cold. He stomped his foot as if to punctuate his sentence. I took a deep breath. You will wear your coat or you won't eat. I crossed my arms too. Frank came in. Is there a problem? I held out Dan's coat. He has to put this on to go outside and eat dinner. Why? Now I wanted to stamp my foot. Because it's cold out there. Frank's shoulder raised and lowered. If he gets cold, he'll come in and put his coat on. Frank took the coat from my hand and swatted his son gently on the behind. Go on now, Dan. The boy scampered away, but not before I spied the mocking grin on his face. My fist clenched at my side. How dare you? I hissed. What? Frank truly looked confused. I pulled my shoulders back a bit. Perhaps I didn't know much about the care of small children, but I knew I didn't want to care for a passel of sick ones. I don't want them to catch cold. He grinned as if I had told a joke instead of put forth my serious opinion on the subject. They'll be fine, Rebecca. And I suppose you'll take care of them if they aren't? From the corner of my eye, I spied Sheriff Jeffries and Brother Latham walk through the door. The sheriff's eyebrows lowered. They'll be fine. They aren't frail like... His face crumbled and turned away. Like Clara, he'd almost said. Her children and his. Part of me wanted to wrap my arms around him, but the other part... With great effort, I lowered my voice, kept it calm and even. The children have been my responsibility, and I think I have some say in what happens to them. I spun around to leave the room, my anger boiling like a kettle left too long on the fire. Only a child herself. Frank's mumbled words sent me flying back. Hey, Jeffrey. Happy early birthday. Frank is a donkey. We were doing just fine before you came home. His eyebrows shot up and his mouth dropped open. I didn't wait to measure his response beyond shock. My skirt swirled around my legs as I turned away. His tone softened and his words stopped my flight. I think you need to trust me in this, Rebecca. I wouldn't suggest anything that wouldn't harm my children. I knew that. I really did. I pressed my lips together, determined to keep tears from falling. Only then did I notice Ollie in the corner, her bottom lip trembling. She bit it still. My heart seemed to sink into my toes. Why did caring so much seem to bring out the worst in me? Sheriff Jeffries slapped his hat on his head and put his hand on my elbow. Why don't we take a quick walk before dinner? I nodded and let him lead me away. Ollie's lips puckered and her face flushed as I passed by, stinging me like a slap of wet rain on a cold day. Sheriff Jeffries urged me forward. I stumbled. He righted me again, like on the train platform that day I arrived. Always right where I needed him. So why couldn't my heart leap in his direction? We walked all the way to the shallow creek without our coats. Frank had been right. The afternoon had warmed more than I had thought. This time I talked, and Sheriff Jeffries listened. But instead of recounting my dreams of adventure, I found myself rattling on about the children. He didn't seem to mind. The very antithesis of Arthur. In fact, if Frank had wanted to find a new wife and leave his children with me, I was pretty sure that Sheriff wouldn't object. So I smiled up at him as I walked, trying to make myself feel the wild ecstasy I'd always felt in Arthur's presence. But my heart didn't pound harder, and my chest didn't ache with longing for his touch. As we neared the house again, I noticed his gun belt peeking out from beneath his suit coat. Do you always wear your gun? I asked. Mostly. You never know what will happen. You might have to run down a bank robber or cattle rustler. He grinned. Something like that. I'd read a story once about Pearl Hart, the famous lady stagecoach robber. How would it feel to wear that heavy pistol slung low on the hips? May I try it on? Is this a dirty book? No, this is not a dirty book, Firefly. My gun belt? I nodded, Christmas morning excitement bursting through me. Well, I guess it'd be all right. He unbuckled his belt and handed it to me. Be careful, though. More weight than I expected filled my hands, but not more than I could handle. A lifetime of welding cast iron pots and pans made a girl's arms strong. I strapped the belt around my waist, undecided as to whether I imagined myself a bandit or a law enforcer. I see you found your way back. Frank's clipped words. I ducked my head to hide my smirk, wondering why annoying this man brought such delight. Was it because he seemed to think he had some kind of authority over me? Maybe I wanted him to know I didn't need another mother. Dinner's on, Irene called from the porch. I unbuckled the holster that crushed against the pleats in my dress. Sheriff Jeffries took it from my hand and strapped it on his waist, his cheeks pink as a summer sunset as we made our way inside. Seated around the dining table, the sheriff to my right, Frank across from us, I relaxed as Nola Jean asked unending questions about Oklahoma. You mean there's no cotton? Yes, there's cotton, but we don't grow any. Daddy grows mostly corn. She looked sideways at her mother. Corn's easier to harvest than cotton. I expect so, I said. Although I've never picked cotton myself, I can see y'all grow a lot of it around here. Nola Jean snorted, then apologized. Too much, if you ask me. Be thankful for cotton crops, Nola Jean. Irene slid her knife into the butter and slathered it on a square of cornbread. They clothe and shelter you, Nola Jean sighed. If only it wasn't so much work. And the kid in the hole, lots of mud and walking through muck. Sounds dirty to me. I turn the page? Yeah, I did. Okay. Frank ducked his head to hide a smile. Maybe you won't always live on a cotton farm, Nola Jean. I stared at Frank as I said it. I didn't know why. Maybe because I couldn't look at the sheriff since he sat beside me. Maybe because I wanted Frank to know I didn't intend to stay here forever. Maybe I just wanted to say it out loud to remind myself. You could marry a man who will take you somewhere else, somewhere new and exciting. Nola Jean pushed potatoes around her plate with her fork. That doesn't seem likely, Miss Rebecca. What brought y'all to this place anyway? I directed the question to Irene, but I knew the answer would come from Brother Latham, and maybe Frank would reveal a bit of history on that as well. Hey Brian, good to see you. Brother Latham took another bite of ham and chewed it down before he answered. Black land prairies, good for growing things, especially cotton. Black land? Because of the awful black mud? He chuckled. Pretty much. But it's fertile ground, hard on man and mule. But you have to take the hard with the pleasant in this life. We don't live in the Garden of Eden any longer. The contrast struck me funny. The Garden of Eden compared to the black land prairie? One lush and green and full, one flat and almost barren, and so far as I'd seen, almost colorless. Was that why Clara and Aunt Annabel had cultivated such a profusion of flowers around the house to bring a reminder of Eden? My family's been on this land since the war between the states, Brother Latham said. Frank here is a regular newcomer. Brought his bride, worked for the railroad, and then bought his land. Railroad? My gaze landed on Frank. I'd heard nothing of this before. Frank pushed his empty plate away. His jaw tightened as Janie's wail wandered through the house. He wiped his mouth and stood. Thank you for another mighty fine meal, Irene, but we must be on our way. Sheriff Jeffries leaped to his feet too. I can bring Rebecca home if you don't mind. Frank stopped. He glanced at me, then looked away. I'm guessing you should ask her that question, not me. Sheriff Jeffries put his hand on the back of my chair. Rebecca? Irene folded her hands and propped them beneath her chin. My gaze searched hers, begging her to tell me what to do and not wanting her advice all at the same time. Of course. I pushed away from the table and dabbed the corners of my mouth. But I'll help clean up first. Irene waved her hand toward me, as if shooing off a fly. Don't you bother about that. You go on. So Frank, the children, the sheriff, and I made our way out. I helped the children into the buggy with Frank, gave them instructions to hold Janie and to be good. Dandy trotted off, trying to drag my heart along behind him. May I drive again? I asked as I watched them disappear down the road. I don't think that's a good idea. Sheriff Jeffries pulled at my arm, leading me towards the car. Why not? I walked backward in front of him now, trying to read his face. I'll be more careful this time. And besides, it's daylight. He shook his head. Open the passenger side door for me. I don't like it. I'd rather you ride here. I started to protest, but climbed inside. When he got behind the wheel, I yelled over the engine's roar. So do you prefer I don't drive or women in general? He didn't answer, just steered us over the road. Arms stiff, eyes straightened ahead. I wanted to force him to look at me, talk to me. Instead, I folded my arms and stared out the window. Maybe this wasn't the man God meant for me after all. Hey Darren, good to see you. Thanks for coming in. Mom had her hip dislocated again? Is that a second time or... Yeah, definitely. Prayers for your mom, Brian. All right. Chapter 32. James, I need your help. Authority oozed from Frank's voice the next afternoon, but James didn't budge. I want to stay with Becca and Janie. He slumped his shoulders and stuck out his bottom lip. They don't need you in their way. Now come on. The growl in Frank's voice grew deeper. James fled from the room. Frank started to follow, then stopped. Hands on his hips, chest heaving. His eyes didn't meet mine. He just took Dan by the hand and marched out the door. I smiled a bit. I couldn't help it. If he'd asked me, I could have persuaded James to join them, but he didn't. He didn't think I knew how to handle his children, at least not the way he wanted them handled. Yet I suspect that my way was more like his wife's or Aunt Annabelle's. The look on James's face had told me what I felt was true. He, more than others, it seemed, deeply felt his mama's absence, and in some small way I had filled her place for him. Janie sat on my hip as I climbed the stairs to find my little man. I showed Frank I knew how to deal with the children. James, head and shoulders jutted from under the bed. I sat down on the floor, Janie in my lap. You staying under there all day? No. He scooted back a bit, leaving only his head exposed. But I want to stay here with you. You're such a good helper. I held his chin in my hand. He inched forward. But your daddy needs a helper too. He has Dan. Yes, he does, but Dan's still little. He can't do as much as a big 6-year-old. Let me see how strong you are. He slid from beneath the bed and hopped to his feet. He lifted a large trunk, just like a smidgen off the floor, and let it drop again. Dust scattered into my eyes and nose. See what I mean? They need your help with that heavy work. But I could help you. That's true. But I could call for you when I needed your help. His nose crinkled, and his head turned toward the window. It's such a sunshiny day. I wish I could do my work outside. I said, trying to push him over into the decision I wanted him to make. Well, okay, if you think you won't need me right away. I stood up, Janie in my arms again. We'll be fine. You run along, find your daddy and your brother. He dashed away, his face split into a grin. I might not have spent much time around mothers and their children studying their ways, recognizing their feelings, but I knew what would have motivated me, and it was exactly the opposite of what Mama and Frank would have done. Satisfied, I let Janie walk the stairs in front of me, her hands above her head, her fingers secure in mine. As we tidied the house, little boy laughter carried through the open windows, James with his daddy just where he needed to be. But what would happen to my little man when I left him alone with Frank, or worse, with a new mother? I couldn't think about that. So I laid Janie in her crib and took the short walk to the mailbox, inside the newspaper and a letter. I cringed as Mama's handwriting met my gaze. I chosen not to write her at Frank's homecoming, not yet. She'd insist I come home immediately, and right this minute, that was the last place I wanted to go. She still thought of me as a child to be shielded from life, when while considering me grown up enough to marry off to Barney Graves. Bracing myself with a strong cup of coffee, I opened the letter, thankful that Mama remained a day's train ride away. 2 pages of nothing mostly, until her usual conjuring for me to return home. I'm glad you were able to make it too, Brian. Hey, Crystal, good to see you. Thanks for coming in. Wow, that's crazy, Brian. Ugh. The boys are coming home from France daily now. When that man arrives, you just pack up and come on home. I expect Mr. Sampson will visit soon enough. Someone else can take on those children now." As her words meandered through my head, sermons I'd heard during my growing up years hailed down on me. Words about giving a cup of cold water in Jesus' name, of suffering the little children to come to him. I couldn't quite feel the rightness of Mama's direction, in spite of the fact that she'd offered an escape from Frank's enigmatic nature. I curled my hands around my coffee cup, wishing I could see through the walls of the house to where the boys and their daddy worked. I imagined Frank's big hands taking his son's smaller ones, teaching them, training them. I couldn't envision him barking orders or sitting idly by watching his son struggle. "Becca, Becca, come quick. Dan fell out of the hayloft and he's crying for you." Coffee ran in a river across Mama's letter on my chair as my chair thumped to the floor. "Stay here and listen for Janie," I called to James as I ran out the door. "Please, Lord, not Dan." I raced through the barn door and dropped to my knees, hovering above the 4-year-old's tear-streaked face. I pushed his hair away from his eyes. "Hush, baby. Tell me where you hurt. Tell Becca." No words, just sobs. My gaze flew from one end of the barn to the other, frantic, anger wrestling with fear. Where was Frank? Where was he? I slid one arm beneath Dan's knees, the other beneath his neck, and I lifted him into my lap. His body pressed next to mine. He cried out. I loosened my grip. "Frank!" My scream echoed through the cavernous building. "Frank!" I tried to stand, but Dan's limp weight threw me off balance. "Frank!" "What?" The barn door framed him as he barked the word. "We have to help him." I stumbled to my feet this time, lurching toward the wide-eyed man. "What do you think I've been doing? The buggy's hitched. I'm taking him to dock." I blinked into the sunlight. "But you left him alone." Frank held out his arms, his face paler than I remembered. "Give him to me so I can get him to town." Measured words through rigid lips. He stalked away, Dan crying more loudly with the jostle of every step. I hurried behind them. "You can't drive and hold him at the same time." Frank mashed his lips together as Dan screamed louder. I scrambled into the buggy and reached for Dan. "Let's go. Someone has to stay with the others. Ollie will be home soon. They'll be fine. Now give him to me." He laid his son in my arms and leapt onto the seat beside us. "Stop at the house and we'll tell James." Frank's jaw tensed, but he did as I suggested. Then he slapped the reins on Dandy's back and we took off toward town. I refused to look at him as we traveled. Instead, I wiped Dan's face and whispered in his ear until his crying quieted. When we pulled up in front of Doc Reisinger's house, I handed Dan to his father and watched him disappear inside. My hands shook in my lap as I begged God to heal Dan and to be with Frank too. For when he'd taken Dan from my arms, he looked of utter despair on a man's face, had swept every strand of frustration from my body. I might doubt that he'd ever approve of me, but I could never question how much he loved his children. We returned home hours later, my stomach in knots over the state of the other children in the house. The last thing I needed was an "I told you so" from Frank. I held my breath as we neared the yard. The buggy stopped. Dan's feet hit the ground with eagerness to display his latest badge of courage, a tight sling to keep his sprained arm still. Doc seemed to think he would be fine in no time. I refused to wait for Frank to help me down from the buggy. Although my steps weren't as energetic as Dan's, I lingered on the porch, listening to the children's banter from inside, while Frank took the buggy to the barn to unhitch. Just as he strode into the yard, the screen door creaked open. "Supper's ready." Ollie let the door slam shut again. Frank sighed. You were right. Ollie has everything under control. She's an amazing girl, really. I managed a weary smile as I read in his eyes the apology he didn't speak. With the dishes finished and the children settled in bed, I eased down on the porch steps near the kitchen door. The aching tired of a crisis survived had seeped into my very bones. I leaned back on my elbows and looked into the evening sky. Had it only been a month since Arthur's visit? 2 months since he shattered all my dreams? Orange and pink melted into the darkness, blue twilight. What did a sunset look like from an airplane? Were the colors more intense or less noticeable? Maybe the whole thing could only be appreciated with your feet planted firmly on the ground. Frank's footfalls sounded across the dirt, stopping just inside the house yard, a pail of milk in his hands. I shivered and started to rise. Don't get up, he said. I sat back down. He set the milk pail on the porch. I've missed this. He eased down on the wide stair beneath me, hands folded, elbows resting on his knees. Clara and I used to sit out here most nights, except the cold ones, after the babies were abed. Just sit and enjoy. His voice cracked on the last word. I twirled my shoelace, not sure how he felt about me witnessing his grief. I squinted into the waning day and contemplated the rock-edged path that led to the barnyard and outbuildings. The crickets chirped. A few chickens squawked before calming. Old Bob let out a moo. The pungent scent of manure wavered on the gentle breeze. Frank shifted on the step, cleared his throat. I made the effort of conversation. Y'all certainly made a nice place here. He took a deep breath and nodded. It's all Clara and I ever dreamed of. Growing livestock and crops and children. Hard work, but honest. I can't imagine a better life than this one. But Brother Latham said something about the railroad money. I bit my lip as I remembered the strain between us that day, dining with the Lathams. He pulled a weed and stripped the leaves from its stalk as he spoke. I hired on at the railroad shortly after we married. Found I caught on quick about how things worked, how best to build, and where. He shrugged. It paid for this farm. We didn't want to buy it on credit. My cheeks warmed. He hadn't yet mentioned the $5 on account at Crenshaw's store, did he know? It was why the army needed me, he said. Needed him. He hadn't run off searching for adventure or wanting a reprieve from responsibility. He'd been asked to go, and in doing so, he'd missed a final goodbye to his wife. My throat tightened, imagining the agony of such a decision. So what will you do now? Keep on. God gives us dreams of what our lives will be, but He doesn't guarantee them. Just asks us to trust Him with the changes. Frank rose, extending his hand to help me to my feet. The loop-sided grin on his face making him look no older than I. Besides, I have you to help take care of things for a while. My fingers rested against his calloused ones only for a moment, but tingles raced all the way down to my toes. I ducked my head and hurried into the kitchen. On the table, I spied Mama's soggy letter. No, she didn't need to know Frank had come home. Not yet. You guys want another chapter? You want to stop there? Let me know. If you want another one, put a 1 in the chat. We've done 2 chapters so far. No, we've done 3 chapters so far. Dragon says another one. Tell Barrett hello for me, Jess. I will tell him hello. He's finishing up feeding the animals, I believe. Jeffrey says 1 too. Brian says one. Hey, Marshmallow Man. Alright, we're going on to chapter 33 then. Wondered if you like a little company. Sheriff Jeffries stood in the kitchen doorway, his hat in its usual place, his hands. Interesting how he arrived just minutes after Frank left to help a neighbor repair some fencing. I'll let him know you said hi too. I pushed back a strand of hair with my wrist, hoping the flour coating my hands didn't dust my face in the process. I just put a pie in the oven. You're welcome to stay. Sheriff Jeffries slid into a seat at the kitchen table, laying his hat on his knee. I turned to the wash bucket and plunged my hands into the tepid water. The part of me that desperately needed a friend thrilled to see the sheriff, but the part that pondered my future trembled. Did I dare do as Frank and trust God to work out the changes to my dreams? Alright, Vermont, thanks so much for hanging out. Stay happy, healthy, and safe, and have a great evening. I dried my hands on a towel and pushed away thoughts of city lights and evenings at the theater and purchasing my own automobile. I had enough to occupy the present. The pie would take the greater part of an hour to cook. After that, it would need to cool. And in the meantime, the sheriff and I could share some friendly conversation. So what brings you out our way today? I counted scoops of coffee into the pot before resting it on the hot stove. Nothing special. Help pull a touring car from a ditch. Someone from over in Trell. He recounted the story, making me laugh. My spirit settled into comfortable as we talked of everyday things, neither of us mentioning the awkwardness of the past Sunday. As I poured each of us another cup of coffee, the kitchen door swung wide. Smells good, Becca. James plopped himself on the bench at the table, his little legs swinging, his chin resting in his upturned hands. Dan's actions mirrored his brother's. I couldn't help but laugh. Would you boys like a glass of milk? They both nodded. Then I heard Janie's babble from upstairs. When I returned with her, the sheriff sat chatting with the boys and Ollie just home from school. Pie'll come out of the oven soon. I sat Janie's feet on the floor, her hands banging on the bench seat. We can all have a small piece now and still have some for after supper. Dan threw a weary look my direction. Even Janie? She's awful little. We all looked at the baby. She moved her feet until her hands gripped the spindles that formed the back of the sheriff's chair. Two new teeth gleaming white in the midst of pink gums. She laughed as if she knew we spoke of her. Then her fingers flew free of their grip. She tottered 2 steps and fell on her behind. For a moment, no one said a word. Then Dan busted out laughing. Janie walked! Ollie squealed and ran to her little sister. Janie, you walked! Pride swelled my chest as I joined the celebration around the baby. What's all the commotion? Frank stood in the doorway, his face weary, his clothes dusty, but his eyes lit with our joy, even without knowing the source. Daddy, Janie walked, all by herself. Watch. Ollie coaxed her sister into 2 more steps. I clapped my hands. Then I looked at Frank. The grief covering his face killed the laughter on my lips. He walked from the room without a word. Oh, thank you, Brian. Thank you so much. Brian says, seeing you and everyone in the chat made my day, Jess. By the time I pulled the crusted pie from the oven, Frank had returned. But in spite of his efforts, I read the sorrow behind his eyes. The wishing that he could share the moment with Janie's mother, not me, not Sheriff Jeffries. Any news from home lately? The sheriff sat beside me now, his question drawing me away from the family commotion around the table. Not much. I ran my fork through my pie. I lifted it a bit to my mouth as I watched Frank interact with his children. Mama seemed on the mend. Will has gone off in his car to see the country. Sheriff Jeffries nodded. He glanced at Frank before turning back to me. So you aren't headed home anytime soon? No, my stomach twisted. I set down my fork and pushed my plate to the side. You done with that, Becca? James asked. 'Cause I could finish it for you. Frank looked at my plate, at me, at Sheriff Jeffries. I avoided his eyes. Share it with your brother. More coffee, anyone? On my feet again, I smiled at both men and turned to get the coffee pot. I wanted to be sick, and I had no idea why. Instead, I played the perfect hostess, filling cups and chattering until finally the sheriff rose to leave. Brian says, you're very welcome, Jess. We walked to his automobile, leaving the clatter of the kitchen far behind. Strings of cloud drifted near the horizon, like tufts of cotton ready to be spun into thread. May I come visit again? Saturday evening? He glanced back towards the house. Visit? Us? You, Rebecca. I want to visit you. A Saturday night visit? My mouth felt dry as dust, and my heart pumped faster. Should I commit to more than a friendship? I couldn't let myself think too hard, so I stared straight into his face and answered, That would be nice, Henry. Why did I feel like a traitor as I spoke his name? I'll make another pie or a cake or something. A grin stretched across his face as he slapped his hat on his head. I'd like that. He cranked the engine and waved as he climbed behind the wheel. I waved back. When he motored out of sight, I sighed and turned. I ran smack dab into Frank. Hands on my arms, he steadied and dizzied me all at the same time. Is he coming again? I nodded. Saturday night. I hesitated. Is that okay? I couldn't look him in the face. If it's what you want. He nodded toward the retreating automobile, something wistful in his voice lifting my heart. I raised my eyebrows, but my gaze skittered to the house behind me. Shy and uncertain, I longed for a retreat, so I stepped around him. I'll start supper. That is, if anyone's hungry. That night, I lay in bed sorting through the photographs in my mind. Barney Graves, Arthur, Sheriff Jeffries, Frank, the children. I spun out stories of the way things might go, but each ending soared with an unsettling regret, almost as if I'd baked a perfect cobbler but forgotten to sweeten the filling. I pulled the covers over my shoulder and faced the wall. Mama would say to take the sure thing. But was anything in life a sure thing? Irene would say be careful not to overlook what appeared to be the less exciting choice. Yet right now, every path open to me appeared tainted with the mundane. I wiggled onto my other side, facing the dark room. What, Lord, what do you want me to do? Silence as usual, no direction, not a niggling thought, not a feeling. I could simply go ahead and make my own choice, but thus far, my choices hadn't exactly worked out. I imagined again Arthur's golden hair lifted by a breeze, the hurtful words of an engagement spilling from his lips. Why, in spite of all of it, did the thought of him still thrill my heart? I tossed back the covers and shivered in the cold night. I hadn't thrown out the last of the coffee. Maybe a cup would distract my thoughts. My socked feet muttered my footsteps as I groped my way to the parlor and threw a quilt around my shoulders, holding it closed in front. Then I padded my way to the kitchen. I found the lamp, but my fingers resisted striking the match. A silver of the moon shone through the window. It would be enough. A new piece of wood and a fraction of rearranging brought a flame to life in the stove. I reached into the cooler to pull out the last piece of pie, larger than I would normally eat, but comforting all the same. Pie plate and fork resting in the center of the table, I touched the coffee pot, almost ready. The door behind me creaked. I whipped around, my hand pressed against my hammering heart. I guess we had the same idea. Frank's voice loomed from the shadow doorway. I guess we did. I pulled the quilt closer to my body, thinking I ought to leave, yet wanting to stay. Come on in. Coffee's almost ready. I heard Frank step inside. He sat in a chair at the opposite end of the table. You willing to share? He nudged the pie plate in my direction. Split it down the middle. There's plenty for both of us. I pushed it toward him, heard the scrape of metal against metal before the plate slid back in my direction. I could make out the glint of the fork resting against its side. Then the smell and steam of the coffee curled around my nose, and I realized a cup sat in front of me. Thank you. My fork slid through the creamy custard. A sip of coffee melted the sweetness in my mouth before mingling it down my throat. I'm sorry about earlier. I took another bite, another sip. You've nothing to be sorry for. Yet I wondered what he meant. 3 quick bites and my pie disappeared. My fork clattered into the empty pan. It's not any of my business what you do with your life. No, it isn't. I wrapped one hand around my warm cup and lifted it to my lips. But do you mind if I ask what you intend to do with it? Uncertainly colored his voice. Was he afraid to hear my answer, or afraid he couldn't restrain comment on it? I cleared my throat, uncomfortable now, even with the cover of the night over our faces. Yet something in me needed to talk, and Frank might understand. He'd lost his love, even if part of his dream remained intact. I'm not sure exactly. I thought God had made it very plain. Now I don't know. Quiet filled the room. Then his chair creaked. I took a deep breath. I've lived on a farm my whole life, but I've always wanted to live somewhere else, somewhere big with lots going on. My brother Will, he got to see the world, to do something important like you did. I want the same opportunity. More silence. The world is changing so fast. I don't want to miss it. His boots shuffled against the floor. I can see how you'd feel that way, but I guess it depends on how you define important. I shrugged. Same as everyone, I guess. Something big, something lasting. His shadow leaned against the Wilson cabinet now. I think tending my farm and raising my children are the most worthwhile things I can do. So did Clara. That's why we agreed I should go to France, to make the world a safer place for them. My insides jiggled. Perhaps a late night snack hadn't been such a good idea. I pushed back the chair. I better get some sleep. The children will be up early. I'll be praying for you, Rebecca. His voice rumbled from nearby. I could feel the heat from his body, smell the scent of fresh hay on his clothes. He took the dishes from my hand. I'll clean up. I nodded, even though I doubted he could see my response. Then I fled up the stairs and dove into bed, pulling quilts over my head. Daylight couldn't come soon enough. Dragon puts on the Barry White music on the old turntable. You want another chapter? Let me know. I gotta rearrange though. before we go on to another one. It's getting good now. Jess, we know you just want to see if they end up hooking up alone. Let's see. "12 more, Dragon. 12 more chapters are left." I figured I'd leave it up to you guys since I missed the last reading. If you want another one, I'll read another one. I'm eating my chicken as I rearrange too. How many we got in here? We got 5 still watching. Alright. So we've got the, and no reading ahead, you just. If you guys haven't checked out the chicken tractor saga, I've been posting chicken tractor builds on YouTube, TikTok, and yeah, YouTube and TikTok. So right now we're on, I need to post another one. I'm trying to post them like every 2 hours, 3 hours, something like that. I think the last one I posted was part 7. And I've got 2 more to do. I've got 2 more to post. So if you haven't checked out the chicken tractor, check it out. I think it's pretty awesome. And then I was going to go to the bookstore today. My secondhand bookstore that I enjoy going to. They were having that sale that I was telling you guys about, the fill the basket for $5. And I was going to look for another book for the next reading, but my back was still flared up, and I didn't think I could sit in the car long enough to get there. And then I have to walk up like a huge flight of stairs. I couldn't do it, so I've got a bone to pick with you about the chicken tractor build. What is that? What's the bone you're picking with me? Did you guys enjoy, are you enjoying this book? Is this the type of book that you would want to hear again, or would you like a different topic? Dragon says you're wearing shoes. What the heck? Was I? I don't know. I'm always kicking my shoes off and putting them back on, kicking them off and putting them on. And I never pay attention. You guys are the only ones that pay attention when I'm wearing shoes or not. It's a little too dirty for you, Firefly. I'm gonna have to go back through and look. That's hilarious. I didn't even know I recorded my feet. How did you even see my shoes? Here's the question, Dragon. What color were my shoes? I kind of like this book. It's a bit of history. And that's what I wonder if we should do another one like this or something different. We've got 12 chapters left, and that's going to go pretty quick, actually. Especially if I read three chapters each time. Okay. I believe you now, Dragon. You said they're the peach thong things. I have to go back through those videos and see them. That's hilarious. While I was doing this live, I was having comments come up on videos too, and I think a couple of them were nasty ones. I'm going to have to go check those out. And people are correcting my grammar and my spelling and stuff. I'm like, whatever. That's not what I wanted. Oh, I guess I'm on YouTube in the chat. Duh. You guys, have you ever put, like, I went to make a kale smoothie tonight, and I pulled the heavy cream out of the refrigerator, used it, and went to put it back. Instead of putting it back in the refrigerator, I put it in the cabinet, and Barrett's like, what the heck is wrong with you? As soon as I set it in the cabinet, though, I was like, I realized what I did. I was like, ah. What am I trying to do? I can't even think. Okay, they weren't bad comments. So anyways, let me know later on or whatever if you have a book suggestion or a type of book that you would like to read, like me to read to you next. You guys, I'm going to get off here. I'm going to get on my heating pad. I am going to relax. I want to thank you all for coming out and hanging out and supporting me. Really appreciate it. It's Saturday, so next live will be Monday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll do the Monday night reset, and Dragon will have a playlist ready for us for that evening. So I hope you all stay happy, healthy, and safe. Remember, you're not alone, and you are loved, and I will see you next time. Bye. I've done something similar before. Had my mind on other things and was just operating on autopilot. Have you thought about putting the shoe bike tires on the chicken tractor? Not the, what did you say? The shoe bike, putting the bike tires on the chicken tractor. No, but the, we took apart the, what is that? It's like a wheel horse for a hose. I think that's what it's called. You wind up the hose on it, and it's got like the hard plastic big wheels on it. We're thinking about putting that on, but I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what happens. All right, everybody. Have a good night. Love you.